The air inside the congressional hearing room was suffocating. Conversations hushed into silence, and every eye locked on the witness table, where Judge Amul Thapar sat rigidly, his tailored suit immaculate, his fingertips tapping against polished oak like a metronome of impatience. He was the embodiment of confidence, or so he wanted everyone to believe. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her blazer with slow precision. Her gaze was razor-sharp, the kind of look that strips away pretense. On the surface, it was just another confirmation hearing. But beneath the formalities, something deeper was about to unfold, something that would leave the entire room stunned. Thapar had entered the chamber certain of his victory. Years on the bench had conditioned him to dismiss challengers, especially young lawmakers still cutting their teeth in Washington. To him, Crockett was just another first-term representative, an obstacle to brush aside. But arrogance is a dangerous weakness, and in the next hour, it would betray him. Because the moment Jasmine Crockett spoke, the ground beneath Thapar shifted. He wasn't facing a politician looking for a soundbite. He was facing someone who had lived the human cost of every cold ruling judges like him issued, and she was ready to dismantle his carefully rehearsed defenses. Before we break down what happened, remember, this wasn't routine politics. This was about to become the moment that shook America's faith in its courts. Judge Thapar's resume gleamed with the polish of privilege and discipline. At 54, he had risen swiftly through the judicial hierarchy, admired by conservatives as a stalwart defender of constitutional originalism. His story, immigrant parents, success through hard work, was a conservative parable of the American dream. To his allies, he was proof that the system worked. But critics knew another truth. The life Thapar lived insulated him from the struggles of those crushed beneath the justice system he presided over. While families scraped together rent or faced eviction, he lived in a pristine suburb. While poor defendants clutched court-appointed files with trembling hands, he mingled at charity galas with elites. To lawyers who argued before him, Thapar was feared for his sharp interruptions and icy interrogations. He was a man who cut others down before they could finish a thought, exuding the authority of someone who never expected to lose. His confirmation team had trained him well. They prepped him on abortion, gun rights, religious liberty, the standard flashpoints. Every answer rehearsed, every phrase sanded smooth enough to pass the Senate test. But what they hadn't anticipated, what they could never anticipate, was Jasmine Crockett. She was no ordinary freshman congresswoman. Crockett's career was forged in the trenches of Texas courtrooms. A civil rights attorney who stood beside clients the system had already written off, she had defended the poor, the powerless, the forgotten. She knew the machinery of justice not as theory, but as lived experience. Her own childhood shaped her fire. Growing up in a working-class family, she had watched her parents juggle jobs just to keep the lights on. Later, as a public defender, she stood by young men and women whose futures were decided not by their crimes alone, but by the lawyers they could, or couldn't, afford. Now she carried those stories into Congress, armed not with talking points, but with scars of reality. Where others skimmed staff memos, Crockett devoured the fine print herself. And today, her preparation was about to expose something Judge Thapar was desperate to keep hidden. The stakes weren't just about his nomination. They were about whether America's courts would continue to serve the privileged while punishing the poor, or whether someone would finally stand up and force the system to confront its own bias. When Crockett's turn came, the energy shifted. She didn't bother with scripted pleasantries. She looked straight at Thapar and asked, "Judge Thapar, in your 15 years on the federal bench, how many defendants have you sentenced to prison?" The question landed like a thunderclap. This wasn't constitutional trivia. This was accountability. Thapar faltered, trying to mask unease. Congresswoman, I don't keep precise statistics, but I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases. Hundreds, she repeated, her pen scratching the word like a blade against the paper. Then, with steady calm, she pressed. And of those hundreds, how many were represented by public defenders versus private attorneys? He shifted. I don't see how that's relevant. I treat all defendants equally. But Crockett leaned in, her voice steady and cutting. I spent 8 years as a public defender. I know what equal treatment looks like, and what it doesn't. So I'll ask again. For the first time, the judge's composure cracked. He muttered a rough estimate. 60 to 70% had public defenders. That's when Crockett struck. She pulled a folder from beneath her desk and opened it deliberately. Because your record shows something else. In cases with public defenders, your sentences averaged 18 months longer than in cases with private attorneys, for the same crimes. Gasps rippled through the room. Supporters who moments ago looked smug now stared in disbelief. Activists leaned forward in their seats. Thapar's face tightened. He sputtered about context, guidelines, complexity. But Crockett's voice sharpened with conviction. The numbers don't lie, Judge. And in drug possession cases, defendants with public defenders received prison time 93% of the time in your court. Private attorneys? 67%. Same charges. Same histories. Very different outcomes. The gallery went silent. Thapar gripped the table, jaw tense, eyes darting. He tried to reclaim the narrative, accusing her of cherry-picking. But Crockett wasn't done. Equal justice, she shot back, raising her voice for the first time. I have here 23 cases, 23 lives, where your sentences reveal something far more damning. The room held its breath. The battle lines were drawn, and Judge Thapar, for the first time in his career, looked like a man cornered. The sound of case files slamming onto the table cracked through the silence like a gavel of judgment. 23 files, 23 lives. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett let them fall in a heap before her, the echo lingering like a verdict already delivered. And that's just from the last 2 years, she said, her voice steady but cutting. The room froze. Judge Thapar, once composed beneath the hot lights, now looked like a man unraveling. A thin sheen of sweat darkened his temples, betraying the pressure he could no longer conceal. These accusations are unfair and unfounded, he tried, clinging to the script that had carried him this far. I follow federal sentencing guidelines in every case. Crockett leaned forward, her voice slicing through his defense. Do you? Because federal guidelines allow discretion, Judge, and your discretion seems to punish the poor while protecting the privileged. That's not justice. That's a two-tier system where freedom belongs only to those who can afford it. The chamber stirred. Reporters hammered at keyboards. Legal scholars whispered, eyes darting nervously. It no longer felt like a hearing. It felt like a trial, with Thapar in the defendant's chair and Crockett holding the evidence. And then, with surgical precision, she unleashed the strike no one saw coming. Judge Thapar, do you remember the case of Sarah Henderson? The name detonated in the hearing room. Pen stilled. Conservative advisors exchanged frantic glances. Thapar's face drained of color. I've handled many cases, Congresswoman. I don't recall every name. His voice was weaker now, hollow. The authority he once commanded was bleeding out in real time. Crockett's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of certainty. She had him. Let me refresh your memory, she said. Sarah Henderson. A single mother of 2. No record. Arrested with less than 2 grams of cocaine. Working 2 minimum wage jobs, struggling to keep her family afloat. Assigned a public defender who met with her for 12 minutes before sentencing. Each detail struck like a hammer. The hearing room, moments ago buzzing, was now deathly still. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was flesh and blood. A woman's life wrecked under the weight of Thapar's gavel. "You sentenced her to 2 years in prison," Crockett continued. "Her children went into foster care. She lost her apartment. She lost everything. Do you remember her now?" Thapar's hands trembled as they clutched the table. His eyes darted downward, searching for words that refused to come. Every case is difficult, but I have to follow the law." "The law?" Crockett's voice sharpened, fury finally breaking through her composure. 3 weeks before Sarah Henderson's sentencing, you presided over another case. Michael Brennan III, son of a prominent attorney. 5 grams of cocaine, more than twice Sarah's. Do you remember what you gave him? The comparison landed like a body blow. Thapar stayed silent. His silence screamed guilt louder than any denial. "You sentenced Michael Brennan to probation and community service," Crockett said, her voice like a blade. "No prison time. No foster care. No lost apartment. The difference wasn't the crime. The difference was wealth, influence, connections." Gasps swept the gallery. Republican members shifted uncomfortably. Progressive activists leaned forward, tears in their eyes. Crockett pressed on. "So tell this committee, Judge. Tell the American people how justice is equal when Sarah Henderson's children grow up without their mother, while Michael Brennan enrolls in law school at his father's alma mater." The explosion that followed was chaos incarnate. Reporters shouted questions. Senators argued over one another. The chairman pounded for order, his gavel useless against the storm Crockett had unleashed. Thapar tried one last desperate defense. "Congresswoman, you're oversimplifying." "What circumstances?" Crockett roared, rising from her seat. "The circumstances that Sarah Henderson was poor and black, while Michael Brennan was rich and white? Because those seemed to be the only differences that mattered." The room erupted again, but Crockett wasn't finished. She raised a document high, her voice steady as she read aloud. "From your own nomination hearing 15 years ago, justice must be blind to wealth, race, and social status. Every defendant deserves equal treatment under law." She looked up, her eyes burning into his. "Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The silence that followed was devastating. Thapar sat frozen, lips parted, no words escaping. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, I have always tried to be fair." "Tried?" Crockett's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Sarah Henderson is still in prison. Her children are still in foster care. Michael Brennan walks free. That's not trying. That's discrimination with a gavel." She pulled out one final document. This is a letter from Sarah Henderson, written from her prison cell. She wonders if her children will remember her when she's released. She asks if she'll ever rebuild her life. She asks why justice failed her, while it protected someone who committed the exact same crime. The chamber was silent again, every soul gripped by the weight of her words. Crockett's voice softened, but her eyes never wavered. "Judge Thapar, can you look me in the eye and tell me Sarah Henderson received equal justice under law?" He couldn't. He lowered his gaze, trapped in silence, a silence that said more than any defense could. When he finally spoke, it was barely audible. "I followed the guidelines available to me." "No, Judge," Crockett replied quietly. "You followed 2 sets of guidelines. One for people like Sarah Henderson, another for people like Michael Brennan. And that is not justice. That is corruption dressed in robes." The gavel pounded, but it was meaningless. The hearing was over, not in form, but in substance. Thapar had entered as a rising judicial star. He was leaving as the face of everything broken in the American justice system. Within minutes, the footage flooded social media. Sarah Henderson Matters trended nationwide, carrying with it thousands of stories from ordinary Americans who had lived the same disparity. Legal analysts across networks confirmed what Crockett had revealed. This was no cherry-picked anomaly. It was a pattern. Conservative institutions scrambled to contain the fallout, their polished talking points now brittle against the raw power of a mother's lost years. Progressive groups seized the moment, releasing reports long prepared, but never so perfectly timed. And Jasmine Crockett, once dismissed as inexperienced, was suddenly a national force. A civil rights lawyer turned congresswoman who had shown in real time that courage and preparation could shake the foundations of power